Shamubeel, thank you very much for taking time to come and talk to us today. It's good to have you here.
Pleasure.
I'd like to start 30-odd years back at the beginning of the substantial changes that were made around the mother of all budgets with Ruth Richardson and Rogernomics as perhaps one of the key moments in the New Zealand housing system. Can you talk me through, from your perspective, what you've seen evolve in the 30 years subsequent to those significant policy changes around the New Zealand housing system?
A little bit of context, Paul. So New Zealand was actually doing really well in housing post the Second World War. We had a unified plan in terms of how we're going to build more houses and get more people into shelter, because we had a big housing crisis pre the Second World War. That was all working until the economic crisis of the 70s and 80s. And when that happened, we undid so much of the policies and things that we had that it has had a long-lasting effect on the housing market, on welfare, on poverty, you name it, across many different parts of society. What we saw was this wholesale change that went too far in some instances. And when it comes to housing, it meant that until about 2020, we had 43 years of not building enough homes.
Could you comment, as we rolled through those decades of neglect, what the sort of compounding impact is that we've seen within society here in New Zealand?
The accumulation of that neglect came through a few different things. One was we just simply were not building enough homes. But also we had other things that were happening at the same time. We had the liberalization of the banking system, essentially this push towards housing as an investment, as your only way to invest money. All of those things happened at the same time. So what we saw over time was this lack of enough homes, and we started to see people getting more crowded and having pressures on that side of things. But we also saw house prices and rents starting to increase a lot, so becoming less affordable. So not enough, too expensive, and quite often unmatched. So we were building houses that were getting increasingly bigger, but not necessarily for where the need and demand was. So quite often there's this imbalance that the market, the housing market and the economics market that was there, it was capable of building houses, but only for people who had enough money, who had enough resources. If you're not in that group, then you're on your own.
I'd like to go a little bit deeper in terms of specific roles that we're describing there, because in some cases, many New Zealanders may believe that the market is performing really well and that the housing market's providing the housing that is needed. And often New Zealanders look to Wellington for innovation or what the government is doing or what the government is not doing. Can you help with your perspective on the role of government given our housing crisis and contrast that with the role and the function of the market?
I think New Zealand follows a very similar parallel to the UK, because we went through the same kind of reforms at about the same times with the same kind of rules and regulations. So the reforms that Thatcher did in the UK had a very similar parallel effect. And what happened there and here was that we said we will not have the government, either local or central government, building housing for poor people. We will not do social housing and we will not do affordable housing because the government is crowding out the supply of that in the market. But it turned out the evidence is very much to the contrary, that there is not enough money to be made in building houses for poor people. So when the government stepped away from the provision of social housing and affordable housing, all that happened was we stopped building those houses. The market continued to build houses for people who have money because you know what? That's where the profit is. So it's not surprising that that continued. So the market actually does work. It works really well for those who don't have other barriers, like poverty, like mental health, like other complex and high needs. Those issues are not easily solved. And there is still a role to play in the market to provide housing for people, because the reality is that we will not be providing housing for those people unless there is a subsidy or there is some other greater desire for people to make an impact and help people who are in worse need than we are.
Historically, state housing, as it was called in years gone by, catered to a much broader range of households and cohorts, and some, perhaps the majority of people that were being placed into or provided with state housing simply were there because they couldn't afford the rent in any given location. It seems that in recent times the nature of state housing tenants has changed, and I meet regularly with the likes of our colleagues at Kāinga Ora or from the community sector, and in many areas in New Zealand, people who simply have an affordability issue haven't had access to a public or state house for a number of years. What are you seeing and hearing in terms of the function that public housing or state housing plays in the New Zealand society in our current modern times?
The purpose and the nature of social housing has changed a lot over time. So when it was first started, it was also about building up capacity and capability in the construction sector. Some of the largest construction companies that you say today, like Naylor Love or Fletcher Building, they really grew on the back of those long-term contracts for many houses from state housing. So it was very much a whole package to build a lot of homes that were fairly modest and moderately priced, that was accessible to a wide range of people. So it wasn't that it was only for people with very high and complex needs. It was also just for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to buy their own home or be able to rent affordably. And that worked fine because we built up that stock of state housing very quickly in the 50s and 60s. And by the 1990s, that momentum really slowed. So the number of state housing in New Zealand peaked in 91, and relative to population, it's now at the lowest level since the 1950s. So we've given up a lot of that ground. And because we don't have enough social housing, we no longer can house that broad spectrum of people. The only people who are able to access it are not only the people who have affordability problems, but also people who have those high and complex needs, quite often with mental health or substance abuse or other issues that people have. Because the reality is that when you have this very limited stock, it is going to be given to those people with the most complex and the highest of needs.
Shamubeel, in many parts of the world, including just across the ditch in Australia, there are mechanisms, financial structures such as Housing Australia or what was previously the NHFIC, which is a structure that allows community providers to access lower cost of capital to do both the construction of new affordable housing supply and also the ownership and holding of that. Can you talk me through what it is you think are the key barriers to us in the New Zealand context providing lower cost finance into the provision of new affordable housing supply?
So when it comes to the community housing sector in New Zealand, it's relatively small because until recently, most of the public housing and social housing was provided by the state, a little bit by local government and a little bit by charities and community organizations. And so as a result, we haven't had a unified approach in terms of how would we fund and finance the community housing sector. And as we have started to see the sector grow, we've seen those pressures really coming through. Not only do we need to create those long-term, the income certainty for the social houses to be able to maintain these places so that we can provide secure housing for people who lack security of housing. But we also need to have capital because building houses in New Zealand is extremely expensive and the cost of capital is relatively high. So if you're spending a lot of your money on cost of borrowing, then there is less available for doing all those other services that our tenants need. So when you look around the world, there are lots of other ways of providing capital. And one of them, of course, is that compared to a bank, for example, a government or a local government would be able to borrow at a much lower rate because they're larger, they have larger balance sheets, they have the powers of taxation, so they can borrow money at cheaper rates. Being able to unlock that kind of capital is really useful because in the end, it's the cost and benefit accrues to the same part, right? Because the costs of homelessness, the cost of housing insecurity is felt, yes, by those individuals who are experiencing that insecure housing, but also the broader society. We see that in terms of health, we see that in terms of crime, we see that in terms of a whole bunch of other things. And so if we're able to save money on those other bits and pieces, then we should also be willing to fund the increase of the capacity and the maintenance and running of these operations. At the moment, those things are not joined up. So our financing and funding structures are very much hands-off. We say, oh, it should be the market that takes care of it. But we're not dealing with the market. We're dealing with a market failure. And there are social and wider well-being consequences that comes out of it. So my sense is that there is a real opportunity for us to be able to leverage the balance sheets and the capital that's available of local governments and central governments to be able to build the houses that are necessary by community housing organizations with good supervision and oversight, of course, but also long-term certainty of those contracts, because we want to make sure that when we look to provide security of housing for people, that is actually funded and actually financed with money that is also secure, because you can't solve insecurity with more insecure structures.
One of my highest priorities in this role is looking at ways of unlocking that mechanism that might reduce the cost of that capital. And my understanding is there's no legal impediment through the Public Finance Act or other mechanisms that is stopping the government from providing an underwrite, a first loss position or a guarantee to the finance that is being used or deployed to support new public housing, where there's obviously a lower risk profile, especially when you have a 25-year contract to pay full market rent for that dwelling. Any insight in terms of the blockage or the thinking that's going on, particularly in the likes of Treasury, that might be holding up the progress of the delivery of that mechanism in the New Zealand context?
So there are no true impediments to government being able to play a role in this. The reality is that we have seen, for example, the role of Kāinga or Housing New Zealand change over time. When it was a corporation, it had to borrow on its own balance sheet. But then it's very easy for us to change the rules and let them borrow on the government's balance sheet. So especially when we know that tenants are going to be funded by long-term contracts, and these people are likely to remain in social housing for the foreseeable future, there is no reason why we can't find that balance. Part of it is really around just the way we have done things. There's a lot of inertia in the way that we do government or the business of government. And I believe that is the biggest reason why we're not using the full benefit of government balance sheets to build housing for both Kāinga, for state housing, as well as community housing providers. And it's not necessary that the government needs to necessarily provide all the debt or all the capital. It might only do an underwrite or some kind of guarantor or some kind of role that says we are here to support this sector, and that would be enough to lower the cost of capital. And any cost of capital that's reduced for the community housing provider immediately flows through to better service delivery, more resilient structures within our community housing providers. But mostly it's a savings also to New Zealanders, because it costs us less to support people who are in high housing needs. So there is this weird circular thing where we're so short-term in our focus that we forget that we're cheating ourselves by not supporting the community housing providers do the job that we ask them to do.
Shamubeel, in the New Zealand context, there's a lot of incoherent policy interventions and funding interventions. We've got special needs grants, we've got emergency housing, we've got transitional housing. It's messy and incoherent, and it doesn't really reflect the way people live their lives. Can you talk a little bit about the policy and funding and the slicing and dicing of poor people into those inappropriate structures?
So when we think about the contracts and programs that we have in terms of housing support and wraparound services, quite often these things have grown organically over time because there was a need or a gap that people were trying to solve. And unfortunately, it's a bit like a cancer, right? It's kind of spread and it's grown and it's got its own kind of life. But it's not working, because what we're doing is we're saying that these policymakers in Wellington understand which bucket you sit in. and that if you are this kind of poor with these kinds of need, then you'll get these kinds of services. But the reality is there is no one shape or face of poverty. Poverty is inherently unpredictable. It is non-linear, and we know that it's not consistent. You might have an episodic need right now, and you might not need anything for another 2 or 3 years. To say that we're going to have one program that's just right, and that there's a continuum that you start from homelessness, and then you go into supported housing, and then you go into independent rental, and then own your own home, quite frankly, that's bullshit. That is just not true. That is just not how these people are going to live their lives. So when we have contracts, we need to understand that there are lots of gaps in the system, and those gaps become traps because quite often people are unable to navigate the system, unable to move themselves from one place to another. There are better ways of doing it. So if you look at what happens in places like Finland, for example, where they've had enormous success in terms of reducing homelessness by about 80% over the course of the last couple of decades, super impressive. But the model is extremely high trust, and there is one contract, one broad contract that says, here is a more like what we have in New Zealand with health, like whānau ora, to say, here's an outcomes-based contract. But you in the front line, you decide what are the best resources and best support this person needs. Not what programs do we have that we can fit around the person, but what does the person need that fits around them. And so if we make it more person-centric, and if we make it a high-trust model, then you will have much better outcomes. We've seen that in health, but we're still not doing that in housing. And I think the way forward for us has to be that we're not going to be able to slice and dice our poor people into these different compartments and expect that that will work, because it's not true. That is not what the lived reality of poverty, homelessness, and housing insecurity is in New Zealand. So instead, what we need to have are contracts that are flexible and person-centric, high trust, but also high accountability. Our community housing providers should be under scrutiny because they are using public funds, but also we are looking after the most vulnerable people. We want to make sure that they are getting the best of care and they're being held accountable for the services that they provide.
Many housing providers around the country have been experiencing what on occasion seems to be an inappropriate and quite aggressive risk transfer. And what I mean by that is that sometimes it might be the corrections van that turns up with a recently released prisoner who is pushed through the door of one of our housing providers. Sometimes it might be in another context and another scenario, but it doesn't recognise the interagency aspects of that, be they health, corrections, all the other complex needs that are in the mix. What are your thoughts on that risk transfer and how we might better support the people who are caught in the middle of it?
So when you think about some of those very high and complex needs people, quite often they are falling through multiple cracks. This is not a one-off reason why these people are in these situations. Quite often they've been involved with health, mental health, justice, police, social welfare, you name it. There is a wide range of experiences that they've had. But quite often what happens is people say, that's too hard, we don't want to deal with it. So Kāinga Ora doesn't want those people, and they get unfortunately pushed out to the charitable sector because where else are they going to go? And charities are in some ways picking up the slack because there is just no capacity elsewhere in the system. So at the moment, I think charities provide an invaluable service by being able to be that safety net that otherwise these people would be homeless. But the problem, of course, is that we're not necessarily funded for it, we're not resourced for it, and we don't necessarily have the expertise to deal with those extremely complex cases. So there is this mismatch between, I guess, the collective responsibility and the failures that have taken place that has gotten quite often these people into the situations. But the responsibility and the solutions falls on quite often small charitable organizations because their purpose is to help. But the role of the people who should be helping is quite often obscured by that. So it's a really tough one. I don't know if there is an answer, but I think the way forward is much greater interaction and conversation and coordination between our government agencies. Like I said, quite often it will be a failure of corrections and police and health and welfare, quite also education, Oranga Tamariki, you name it. There is a broad range of government agencies that are involved. And if they're not working together, and if we're not learning from this experiencing and going back and saying, why did this happen? We'll continue to make these problems. And unfortunately, that's where we are today. It's very transactional. It's no longer my problem because you're not in my file at the moment. And we end up in the community housing sector taking up a lot of that slack. But I don't think there's enough capacity, even in our sector, to deal with the deluge of demand that's out there at the moment.
I've heard you talk about some pretty radical concepts. One, for example, tax as love, in terms of the transformative, redistributive power of tax when it's done well. I'm interested to hear from you at a personal level, what motivates you, because you clearly feel a passion for social justice, and I'm just interested to know what it is that's brought you to that, what gets you out of bed in the morning from that perspective.
Paul, the purpose of society is to make more people better off. If you're not doing that, we're failing. That's what motivates me. We should make sure that more people can thrive. And when you look around New Zealand, you can see there are big groups of people who are not thriving. And they're not thriving because we're not working together. It's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're incapable of making progress. When they are burdened with poverty and impoverishment and this impoverishment of opportunities, what do we expect? So what motivates me is not that I feel like I'm some sort of good human. It's just that, isn't that what we should all want for each other?
I'm pleased to report that there are some examples of collaboration springing up all over the country at the moment, and one of them is tenancy placement committees, which are up and running in Tauranga and as of this week down in Wellington and already in the South Island. And that's where a group of providers, community providers, Kāinga Ora and other agencies sit around a table together and take people off the social housing register, the waiting list, and then discuss as a team in a specific location who's best placed to provide the best outcome for that household or that family at that time in that place. Can you think of any other examples of good practice that are going on that you've seen that we could perhaps do more of in more places?
Paul, there are lots of really good examples, but if we talk about that, the tenancy case management program, for example, what that shows us is an ability to work together and put the person at the center. So it's not hard, right? We know that the way that we can make progress is if we come together that's people-focused, sometimes location-specific, and we're able to work together in a high-trust model, we will be able to find solutions. That's the thing that excites me about New Zealand, right? We're a country of 5 million people. There is no problem that's insurmountable. You can literally pick up the phone and talk to the right people if you want to. We found it difficult to do everything right, but I think once we see opportunities, we can make it happen. Some of the examples that really excite me, what's been happening in Hawke's Bay, for example, with the housing model there, where they've gotten together and they're working together and they're building homes. It's wonderful. They're trying to do that in Rotorua. Great. What we have seen in the community housing sector in terms of how much collaboration there is, fantastic. What we've seen with KiwiSaver funds willing to invest in community housing sector, awesome. So there are all these unlikely heroes that are out there, but at the core of it is it's about the outcome for the person and high trust. Those two things to me are the magic ingredients to make progress, and all the good news stories that we're going to see in housing, in social housing, is going to stem from those two core components.
We have, in the New Zealand context, some inherently unstable and insecure tenures, and here I'm talking about emergency housing and transitional housing, which were only ever intended to be very short term, but in many cases have turned out to be extraordinarily long term. Why is it you think that we use insecure things when really what we know is that people live their best lives when they have a long-term security of tenure?
Unfortunately, at the moment, we have a whole bunch of housing solutions that are insecure. You're not going to be able to solve the problem of insecure housing with more insecure housing. It makes no sense. Quite often, these solutions have come about because they were a response to an emergency. There was a short-term response. but we never got to the root cause of how to make it better. When I look across the world, the examples that work really well are where we say, if you're homeless and if you're insecure in housing, the solution is to actually solve that and give you secure housing. And there is no alternative to that. And at the moment, I think we are caught in a trap and inertia of continuing to sustain these insecure forms of housing, whether it's the private rental market or whether it's things like emergency housing or transitional housing, which is simply not fit for purpose. If they're the answer, we're asking the wrong question.
From your perspective, do you think there is perhaps a case? What would you say if I said I would like to get rid of transitional housing in New Zealand, a managed transition, but get rid of transitional housing in favour of more permanent solutions? Is that a workable option?
The answer is an emphatic yes. We have to get rid of insecure housing solutions. Insecure housing solutions are not an answer to insecure housing. But we have to do it in a practical and managed way, because there are lots of people who are reliant on these places without which they would be homeless. But in my ideal scenario, when I look to the future and feel optimistic, we don't have any short-term housing solutions, because the reality is that what we need for people who are experiencing insecure housing is access to stable, long-term housing, because that's what gets you the ability to rebuild your lives.
There's a veritable tidal wave of older adults in New Zealand coming through to fixed low income, and many of whom have no assets at all. I'm not sure we are prepared as a nation for the number of older adults who are living in poverty and how we're going to adequately house them. Have you got any thoughts on that?
You don't need an economist to tell you that people get older. And we know that that is coming in a big way, particularly in our provinces. The biggest growth in population is going to be amongst our over 65-year-old age groups. More often than not, we're going to see them reaching retirement age, still renting, quite often with very few assets. And unfortunately for these people, they're not necessarily very high needs. They're quite often just poor. And that means that when you've got a housing market that is dysfunctional, as we have, a social housing sector that's stretched and bursting at the seams, they're not seen as high need enough to qualify for this housing. So quite often these older people are going to fall through the cracks. And I'm really concerned because we don't necessarily have enough houses, nor do we have houses that are fit for purpose. Quite often you need 1 or 2 bedrooms for older people, but you need them to have ramps or not have stairs, or to have doorways that are wide enough, showers that are actually safe for an older person to use. Those really practical little things that make a home accessible are actually not normal in New Zealand. So we are going to face this incredible amount of demand that's coming in the future amongst our older people, and we are not prepared. The other demand that I see in the future is going to come from climate change. One of the things that I'm absolutely confident we will see is insurance retreat. There'll be parts of our communities that will not have access to insurance, and those will be the places that are prone to flooding and storm damage and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, that's where poor people are going to live, and we're going to create ghettos in New Zealand unless we get on top of it right now. I'm not seeing enough progress, and so I think what we're going to see, there'll be future demand that will come, that will be big spikes on the back of natural disasters. Storms and floods are going to create batches and batches of homeless people repeatedly over the course of the coming decades. And again, I don't think we have a plan of how we're going to deal with that. So the future of housing demand, and particularly for the social housing sector, is probably going to come from more sources. And quite often they're going to be either relentless because of aging populations, or because they're going to be very episodic on the back of these very specific weather events.
The New Zealand housing crisis, to put it bluntly, is a man-made problem. So it can be unmade as easily, hopefully, as it was made. If you had 3 or 4 key levers that you could pull to move the system back into a better direction, what might those be?
At a very core fundamental level, we need to have more homes in New Zealand. We simply do not have enough. We need to build houses of every type, every location, for a long period to come to be able to catch up with the neglect of the last 43 years. So that's one. But while we're doing that, there will still be a whole bunch of people who are going to be missing out. And how are we going to make things better for them? Well, we're going to have to invest heavily in affordable rentals, in market rentals, because there's not enough of those either. And we have to build up more of our social housing sector. There is not much more that's required to solve our housing crisis. It's entirely doable. It is about having enough homes. But in that pathway, it's about making sure we also take care of those bits of the housing continuum that are short.
I think it's fair to say that the impact of the housing crisis in New Zealand has significantly broadened, and people of all sorts of means are now feeling the pinch, be it that their children clearly will not be able to raise the deposit if they wanted to own their own home, or we all know there are hundreds of thousands of deeply stressed renters in the New Zealand market. What are your thoughts on how we as a nation can understand the nature of the problem and our role, our responsibility as citizens to play our part in finding and working towards a solution?
I think quite often housing is seen as a deeply personal thing because it's yours, right? You worked hard for it. So people, when they see the increase in house prices since the early 2000s that's made some people extraordinarily rich, they think it was done by their own hard work, rather than the fact that it was a consequence of public policy failure for a number of decades. But I think the reality is dawning on people that yes, you might be better off because your house price has gone up, but it might make your children and your grandchildren worse off because they may not be able to afford to have their own home. They may not be able to access the security of a home that they own, and they might be consigned to our rental market, which is very short term and really quite poor. So it is coming, and I think it's coming slowly. So if you think about the journey of New Zealand, home ownership had been improving from the Second World War until a peak in 1991. So for many decades, the experience was even people whose parents hadn't owned a property could hope to and work towards owning their own place. It wasn't easy, but they made it, and more people joined those ranks. But since the early 90s, that has been falling, and that's the rise of the generation rent. So it doesn't know any color, it doesn't know any age, it doesn't know any location. It is happening in all parts of New Zealand. And today, there is about half of all adults that now rent. And as it becomes more pervasive, and a majority of New Zealanders start to rent, and a majority of New Zealanders struggle to be able to afford their own homes, regardless of if their parents own their own home, that's when it becomes personal. And I think for a lot of New Zealanders, until recently, it hadn't been personal because it was somebody else's problem. And it was about the problem of the undeserving poor. But now that it's affecting their children, and it's their children that can't afford to live in the same suburb as them, that they're having to drive further away and live further away or go to schools that they themselves thought were not good enough. These are having really big implications and an awakening that is coming to New Zealand. So I'm quite optimistic that we will be able to find a way forward. And that's because people are seeing that impact in their own families, in their own children, but more importantly, in their grandchildren. Because there's something about grandchildren people really love. And when they see that the future of their grandchildren doesn't look as bright, there is a much greater buy-in to do things better. And we're seeing examples of that starting to happen. So it does feel like we're not making progress, but if you think about the policy space in terms of how we consent new housing, how we allocate more land towards housing, how we do more infrastructure so houses can be connected up, those things are getting better. Not fast enough, but they're getting better. And by and large, with reasonable bipartisan support from the big political parties. So we are heading in that direction. And as we start to see generation rent getting even bigger, touch the lives of many more people, and most importantly, touch the lives of many more grandchildren, I think we are going to see a consensus in the center of politics that's going to come through, that's going to say, no, we need to house New Zealanders better. But unfortunately, the crisis has to be deeper before that happens.
I think this cuts to the chase in terms of the question of what sort of a society we really want to live in, particularly given intergenerational considerations and what we're leaving for our children and grandchildren. There are commentators who are saying things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. What happens, in your view, if we don't get this right?
If we don't fix housing, we are going to have some serious negative consequences. And that's because housing in New Zealand is shorthand for a whole bunch of different things. It's your shelter. It's your safe place to call home. It's the only type of tenure that provides you with security. It's also how you save for your retirement. It's also how you access money for your business. So there is a whole bunch of different things that are caught up in the idea and the institution of home ownership in New Zealand. So as that becomes out of reach for more and more New Zealanders, like I said, there's about a half of adults in New Zealand who currently rent. We are going to find this society that becomes increasingly divided, and the separation and the gap gets wider and wider. And so you have the rise of the landed gentry versus generation rent, and it becomes a source of conflict. And we know that societies that become very unequal, that become very unbalanced, they lead to some very severe consequences. And those consequences are sometimes very social, in the sense that your social fabric starts to fray, that you don't trust each other. So there is a lot more conflict. There is just a lot more crime. There is a lot more other things. And it's not because people are renting. It's just that there is something that has happened in society where we don't trust each other to the same degree. And we're likely to see the wealthy increasingly moving towards secluding themselves into certain parts of society. And, God forbid, we might see what happens in places like South Africa, where the rich live in compounds protected by private armies. And, that's a very dystopian kind of feature. If you think about what New Zealand is like, a fairly safe place where people have hedges, not fences, and not razor wire. So these are quite important things to get right. New Zealand hasn't yet fallen into that kind of thing, and nor had we been there in the beginning of our last housing crisis, which was around the wars between the two interwar periods. So I'm hopeful that New Zealand has enough of the social fabric to hold things together, but I think we have to work really hard to get housing, poverty, and inequality right, because we haven't done good enough and well enough over the course of the last 40 years.
Shamubeel, it's interesting because as you've said, for many people in New Zealand, because there's inadequate superannuation savings, they see property investment as a mechanism for retirement savings, etc. And there are people with multiple properties, and many of those people actually have become accidental landlords because they were doing the rational economic thing and investing in residential property, because over the long run, typically that asset class has appreciated. Can you unpack that a little bit for us through an economic lens and a social lens, in terms of there are less and less people in New Zealand owning more and more property, and home ownership rates have been on a steady decline for quite some period. What's the harvest of that trajectory if it keeps going in the direction it's going?
What we're seeing is this concentration of ownership and a concentration of wealth. It's not nearly as pronounced as it was, I guess, in the kind of this landed era of the UK, for example, but it is the kind of the future that people fear. And I think that is the fear in my mind as well, that is, as only the rich are able to afford to buy more properties, only the rich are able to expand their portfolios, and more people get locked out. We see this concentration of wealth. And we've got plenty of experience from history that shows what happens when wealth is held very unequally and in a very concentrated way. Because wealth is not silent. It also affects politics. It also affects the way that we make rules and regulations in our society and who it's for. At the beginning I said society is about making more people better off. But when you've got a very small group of people who are very wealthy and very powerful, it becomes their interest to look after that and protect that. And that can skew the politics and the social discourse and social fabric of the country. So we're not there yet, But I think if we keep going down this path of this increasing concentration of wealth, increasing concentration of ownership, increasing concentration of their influence and power in our politics and society, we are looking at that rise of that landed gentry again. And that's a really frightening thing for me, because we know these things end in revolution. They end in crisis and conflict. It would be better and much less disruptive if we were to get on top of it now and really start to address it. And that's about building more houses. It is about focusing on things like affordable rentals and social housing, but also to kind of focus on broadening our tax base. We can't keep piling the taxes on young people who work and spend money. We also need to tax capital, because in New Zealand, capital is lazy. It will inherently chase buying more and more houses from each other, rather than putting into the things that create long-term jobs and wealth and a country that's thriving. And in my mind, we've got to pull all those levers all at the same time. But these are really big conversations. These are really big policy changes. And already those self-interests are incredibly entrenched and incredibly powerful.
Shamubeel, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today. Really appreciate it.